A desperate, high-pitched cry pierced the evening air, making Emma jolt upright in the passenger seat. "Dad, did you hear that?" she whispered, scanning the dense forest that pressed against the narrow mountain road. Something was out there in the wilderness, something that sounded lost and afraid. Just like her. "Probably just a fox," her father said without slowing the car. "These mountains are full of wildlife." Emma pressed her forehead against the car window, unconvinced. The haunting sound had seemed almost human. She watched as concrete and glass of Chicago had gradually given way to endless green. At 12 years old, Emma had never spent more than a weekend outside the city. Now she faced an entire summer in the Appalachian Mountains with an aunt she barely knew. "We're almost there, sweetheart," her father said, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. The rental car struggled up the steep incline, engine protesting. "Aunt Maggie's place is just over this ridge." Emma didn't respond. She hadn't wanted to come, but there hadn't been a choice. Her father's job had taken him overseas for 3 months, the opportunity of a lifetime, he'd called it, and Emma was too young to stay alone. Her mother had left when Emma was 4, and there were no other relatives except Aunt Maggie. The car crested the hill, revealing a valley nestled between 2 mountain ridges. A small farmhouse stood in the clearing, weathered in gray against the vibrant landscape. Fields stretched behind it, bordered by dense forest that climbed up the mountainside. "It looks exactly the same," her father murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "Just like when we were kids." The car bumped down the gravel driveway, stirring up dust that swirled in the late afternoon sunlight. As they approached, a tall woman emerged from the farmhouse, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Aunt Maggie, Emma presumed. She had the same dark hair as Emma's father, though streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical braid. "There she is," her father said, relief evident in his voice. "Your aunt's been living out here alone since Grandpa died. I think she's looking forward to having company." Emma doubted that. From what little she knew, Aunt Maggie was a recluse who rarely visited and never stayed long when she did. What would a woman who chose isolation want with a city kid who couldn't tell a chicken from a duck? The car rolled to a stop, and Emma reluctantly climbed out, stretching her legs after the long drive. The air smelled different here, clean and sharp with pine, nothing like the city's familiar blend of exhaust and food carts and humanity. "Daniel," Aunt Maggie called, her voice surprisingly warm as she approached. "You made good time." Emma's father embraced his sister, the family resemblance obvious now that they stood side by side. "Traffic was light once we got out of the city." Aunt Maggie turned to Emma, her expression softening. "And this must be Emma. Last time I saw you, you were knee-high to a grasshopper." Emma managed a polite smile, uncertain how to respond. Knee-high to a grasshopper? Who actually said things like that? "Hi, Aunt Maggie," she said quietly. "Well, come on in." Maggie gestured toward the house. "You must be tired from the drive. I've got dinner almost ready." The farmhouse was small, but surprisingly cozy inside. Worn rugs covered hardwood floors, and the furniture looked old but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it stood empty in the summer heat. Through an open doorway, Emma glimpsed a kitchen with ancient-looking appliances and bunches of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. "Emma, your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Aunt Maggie said. "Why don't you take your things up while your dad and I catch up?" Grateful for the escape, Emma grabbed her suitcase and headed up the narrow staircase. The room was small with slanted ceilings and a window that overlooked the forest edge. A patchwork quilt covered the bed, and a wooden dresser stood against one wall. It was nothing like her room at home with its posters and electronics, but at least it was private. Emma set her suitcase down and peered out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. Something moved at the edge of the forest, a deer, maybe, or some other woodland creature. This place was so wild, so far from everything familiar. A lump formed in her throat. 3 months felt like forever. How would she survive with no friends, no internet, and nothing but trees and an ant who was practically a stranger. From downstairs came the sound of laughter, her father and Aunt Maggie reminiscing, no doubt. Soon he would leave, flying across the ocean to his important project, while Emma remained here, trapped in this time capsule of a farm. She opened the window, letting in the evening breeze. Cicadas buzzed in the distance, an unfamiliar chorus that only emphasized how far she was from home. As darkness fell over the mountains, Emma had never felt more alone. 3 days into her stay at Aunt Maggie's farm, and Emma had already run out of things to do. No Wi-Fi meant no social media, no streaming, no connection to her real life back in Chicago. Her father had left the morning after dropping her off, his rental car disappearing down the mountain road with surprising finality. "You'll help your aunt with chores," he'd said, hugging her goodbye. "Learn some practical skills." So far, practical skills had included collecting eggs from temperamental hens, feeding goats that seemed determined to headbutt her at every opportunity, and pulling countless weeds from Aunt Maggie's vegetable garden. Her hands were already developing blisters, and her shoulders ached from unaccustomed labor. "City kids," Aunt Maggie had muttered that morning, not unkindly, as she'd handed Emma a salve for her reddened palms. "You've got to toughen up out here." Now, as evening approached, Emma sat on the porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The forest edge loomed dark and mysterious just 100 yards away. She hadn't forgotten the strange cry she'd heard on the drive up. Twice now, in the early mornings, she'd been woken by a similar sound, distant but distinct, like something calling out. When she'd mentioned it at breakfast, Aunt Maggie had frowned. Probably a fox. Though. She'd paused, looking troubled. There have been reports of poachers in these parts, setting traps where they shouldn't. The thought of animals suffering in hidden traps made Emma's stomach turn. She'd always been sensitive about animals. Her father called her a bleeding heart. In Chicago, she'd regularly donated her allowance to the Wildlife Center. A rustling sound from the edge of the forest snapped Emma from her thoughts. She squinted into the gathering twilight. Something was moving there, small and dark against the underbrush. Without really thinking about it, Emma stood and walked toward the tree line. The logical part of her brain whispered cautions about wild animals and strangers, but curiosity pulled her forward. "Hello," she called softly, stopping at the fence that marked the boundary between farm and forest. The rustling stopped. Then, slowly, a small dark head poked out from beneath a fallen log, pointed ears, buttoned nose, and frightened eyes that reflected the last light of day. Emma's breath caught in her throat. A bear cub, tiny, probably no more than a few months old, with dark brown fur and a distinctive white patch on its chest. It looked directly at her, trembling slightly. "Oh," she whispered, frozen in place. Her mind raced through warnings about bear encounters, particularly with cubs. Where there was a baby, a protective mother couldn't be far behind. The cub took a tentative step forward, then whimpered, that same high, plaintive sound she'd heard in the car. It tried to take another step but stumbled, favoring its right front paw. Emma could see now that the paw was swollen, with something metal glinting in the fading light. A trap. The poor thing was caught in some kind of trap. Her heart raced as she glanced back toward the farmhouse. Aunt Maggie had gone into town for supplies and wouldn't be back for at least an hour. Should she wait? Call someone? But who? And how long had the cub been suffering? The little bear whimpered again, trying to pull itself further into the clearing. Emma saw that it was dragging the trap with it, a cruel metal device attached to a chain, which had fortunately broken free from whatever had anchored it. Blood matted the fur around the cub's paw. "It's okay," she whispered, though she knew the animal couldn't understand. "I won't hurt you." Against all common sense, Emma climbed over the fence. She remembered reading somewhere that bear cubs separated from their mothers rarely survived. This one was injured, trapped, and all alone, just like she'd felt when her father left. Dropping to her knees, she inched closer, making soft, reassuring sounds. The cub watched her, ears flicking nervously, but it didn't retreat. "Where's your mom?" Emma murmured, scanning the forest edge. No sign of an adult bear, which was both a relief and a worry. Had the mother been caught in a larger trap? Or worse? The cub tried to stand again, crying out as it put weight on the injured paw. The sound pierced Emma's heart. Aunt Maggie's tool shed was just behind the chicken coop. There would be wire cutters, pliers, something she could use to free the cub. But could she really do this? She'd need to get close enough to touch a wild bear, even a small one. It might panic, might bite or scratch in fear. But leaving it to suffer wasn't an option. "I'll be right back," she told the cub, as if it could understand. "Don't go anywhere." She ran back to the farm, heart pounding. The tool shed was unlocked, its interior musty and dim in the fading light. She rummaged through shelves until she found what she needed: heavy work gloves, wire cutters, and a small first aid kit Aunt Maggie kept for the animals. Emma had just turned to leave when she heard the rumble of an engine. Her stomach dropped. Aunt Maggie was back early. If her aunt found out what Emma was planning, she'd never let her near the cub. Adults always overreacted about safety, and Maggie was more protective than most. She'd call animal control, and who knew what would happen to the bear then? Emma ducked down below the shed window as headlights swept across the yard. She had to make a decision. Now? The cub's frightened cry echoed from the forest edge, deciding for her. Clutching her supplies, Emma slipped out the back of the shed and ran toward the trees. The bear cub was still there, watching her with those soulful dark eyes. It was now or never. Emma knelt beside the whimpering cub, her hands trembling inside Aunt Maggie's oversized work gloves. The bear watched her with wide, frightened eyes, its tiny body quivering. Up close, the trap looked even more barbaric, rusty metal teeth clamped around the cub's front paw, the chain trailing behind like a grotesque leash. "It's okay," Emma whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm going to help you." She tentatively extended her hand, allowing the cub to sniff her glove. It flinched but didn't retreat, perhaps too exhausted from dragging the heavy trap. Its small chest heaved with rapid breaths. Looking at the mechanism, Emma could see it was a spring-loaded trap, the kind designed to catch small animals. The fact that it had caught a bear cub instead of its intended prey made her furious at whoever had set it. The metal ring where the securing chain had broken showed how desperately the little bear must have struggled. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, positioning the wire cutters. But just for a second. As she leaned forward, a harsh voice cut through the twilight. "Emma Jean Carter, get away from that bear right now." Emma froze. Aunt Maggie stood at the fence line, her face a mask of alarm. "It's hurt," Emma called back, not moving. "Someone trapped it. I can help." "That is a wild animal," Aunt Maggie replied, her voice tense as she slowly approached. "Even a cub can be dangerous when injured." "Back away slowly." But the cub chose that moment to cry out again, a sound so pitiful that Emma couldn't bear to leave it. "I can't," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Look at its paw. It's suffering." Aunt Maggie reached the spot where Emma knelt, her expression softening slightly as she took in the cub's condition. "Where's the mother?" "I don't know. I haven't seen any sign of her." Maggie scanned the forest edge, clearly concerned. Bears don't abandon their cubs. If she's not here. The implication hung heavy in the air. Something had happened to the mother bear. After a moment, Aunt Maggie knelt beside Emma, her movements deliberate and calm. "Those are illegal traps," she said quietly. "They've been a problem around here for years." She studied the mechanism, then held out her hand. "Give me those cutters. I've done this before." Relief washed over Emma as she passed the tool to her aunt. "You're going to help?" "I'm going to show you how to help," Maggie corrected. "These traps can snap shut again if released wrong. Watch carefully." With expert hands, Maggie demonstrated how to compress the spring while simultaneously prying the jaws apart. "Now you try," she said, guiding Emma's hands. "Steady pressure, that's it." Together, they managed to force the trap open. The cub whimpered as the pressure released from its paw, revealing a deep, ugly wound. "Poor thing," Maggie murmured, her earlier sternness completely gone. "That's going to need treatment." Emma opened the first aid kit. "Can we use this?" Aunt Maggie shook her head. "Not here. We need to clean it properly, and I want to make sure there's no permanent damage to the bone." She glanced toward the darkening forest again. "We shouldn't be out here much longer. If the mother is dead, there could be predators drawn to." Well, you know. The cub tried to stand but immediately collapsed, unable to put weight on its injured paw. It can't survive out here, Emma said, voice breaking. Not alone. Not hurt like this. Maggie was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable in the fading light. Finally, she sighed. My grandfather had a rule, never interfere with wild animals. She met Emma's pleading gaze. But he also taught me that all life is precious. With surprising gentleness, she reached out and scooped up the cub, which was too weak to struggle much. 3 days, she said firmly. We'll keep it for 3 days, clean that wound, feed it, and then call the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. That's the best we can do. Hope surged through Emma as she followed her aunt back toward the farmhouse. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Maggie warned over her shoulder. That cub needs a lot more help than we might be able to give. And if anyone finds out we've got a bear cub in our shed, we'll both be in serious trouble. In the old tool shed, they created a makeshift pen using an empty chicken crate lined with straw and old towels. Aunt Maggie cleaned the cub's wound with warm water and antiseptic, revealing a deep gash that made Emma wince. Will it heal? She asked anxiously. Bears are resilient, Maggie replied, applying a pet-safe antibiotic ointment she used for her farm animals. But it'll need time. Once the cub was settled, with a small bowl of water and some mashed berries Maggie had pulled from the freezer, they closed the shed door and headed back to the house. You need to understand something, Emma, Aunt Maggie said, her tone serious as they sat at the kitchen table. That bear isn't a pet. It's a wild animal that needs to return to the wild. Getting attached will only make things harder. Emma nodded, though her heart wasn't in the agreement. She already felt connected to the small, frightened creature. Tomorrow morning, we'll go back to where you found it, Maggie continued. We need to see if we can find the mother's remains and look for more traps. Whoever set that one probably has others. A cold knot formed in Emma's stomach. Do you think we'll find her? Maggie's eyes were sad. I hope not, but we need to know. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the cub alone in the dark shed. Was it afraid? In pain? Calling for a mother who would never return? Without really deciding to, she slipped out of bed, pulled on her shoes, and crept downstairs. The night air was cool as she crossed the yard to the tool shed. Inside, a small battery lantern illuminated the makeshift pen. The cub was awake, its dark eyes reflecting the light as it watched her enter. Hey there, Emma whispered, kneeling beside the crate. I came to check on you. The cub's ears perked up at the sound of her voice. You need a name, she decided. I can't just call you Bear. She studied the small creature, its chocolate-brown fur, the distinctive white patch on its chest like a splash of milk, and those intelligent, watchful eyes. How about Coco, she suggested. The cub tilted its head, as if considering. Coco it is, then. As she spoke, Coco shuffled closer to the side of the crate where she sat, sniffing curiously at her fingers. We're going to take care of you, Emma promised. And then, well, we'll figure it out. She didn't want to think about the and then part. For now, it was enough that the cub was safe, its wound cleaned, with food and water nearby. Emma stayed until Coco's eyes began to droop, the cub finally surrendering to exhaustion. Walking back to the house, Emma realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time since arriving at the farm, she wasn't counting the days until she could return to Chicago. Tomorrow held a purpose, helping Coco heal. And for now, that was enough. Dawn broke over the mountains in streaks of pink and gold. Emma was already awake, dressed, and heading toward the tool shed before Aunt Maggie had even started the coffee. She barely slept, her mind filled with worries about Coco. The cub was awake, watching the door as if expecting her. The berry mash was gone, and Emma felt a surge of relief. At least Coco had eaten something. Good morning, she whispered, kneeling beside the crate. The cub made a soft huffing sound, rising shakily to its feet. The bandaged paw remained lifted off the ground, but there was more energy in those dark eyes today. We're going to look for your mom, Emma told Coco, reaching carefully through the slats to stroke the soft fur between his ears. The cub flinched at first, then leaned into her touch, making a sound almost like a purr. I see you two are getting acquainted. Emma startled at Aunt Maggie's voice. Her aunt stood in the doorway, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in her hands. She passed one to Emma, who accepted it gratefully. "He ate the berries," Emma reported. "He?" Maggie raised an eyebrow. Emma shrugged. "Just a feeling." Aunt Maggie knelt beside her, studying the cub with a critical eye. "The swelling's already down a bit. That's a good sign." She sipped her coffee. "I've called Dr. Mercer. He's a vet who helps me with the farm animals. He's coming this afternoon." "You told him about Coco?" "Coco," Maggie repeated, giving Emma a pointed look. "What happened to not getting attached?" Emma flushed. "I just needed something to call him." Aunt Maggie sighed. "I told Jim we have an injured wild animal but didn't specify what kind. He's discreet." She stood, dusting straw from her jeans. "Finish your coffee. We need to check those woods." An hour later, they were retracing Emma's steps from the previous evening. The forest was different in the morning light, less mysterious, but no less imposing. They followed the broken chain marks to where the trap had been anchored to a tree root. "Look here," Aunt Maggie said, pointing to disturbances in the underbrush, broken branches, and flattened vegetation. Something large was dragged this way. Emma's throat tightened. "The mother?" Maggie nodded grimly. "Likely." They followed the trail deeper into the woods, the silence broken only by birdsong and the distant gurgle of a stream. Finally, they reached a small clearing where the signs were unmistakable: blood on the ground, fur caught on low branches, and the disturbed earth where a large body had been. "She was taken," Aunt Maggie said, crouching to examine the scene. "Probably by the poachers who set the trap." "So she's dead?" Emma whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Almost certainly. Black bear gallbladders and paws fetch high prices on the black market." Maggie's voice was bitter. The cub was just collateral damage they didn't bother with. Emma felt a surge of anger unlike anything she'd experienced before. How could anyone be so cruel? She thought of Coco, waiting alone in the shed, his mother stolen from him by human greed. "We have to help him," she said firmly. "We can't just send him away to some sinner." Aunt Maggie stood, her face grave. "Emma, wild animals." "He's not just a wild animal," Emma interrupted. "He's alone and scared and hurt. And it's our fault. Humans did this to him." Something in Maggie's expression shifted. "Our responsibility doesn't mean we can keep him. Bears need to live as bears." "I know," Emma admitted. "But until he's strong enough, he needs us." The vet's arrival that afternoon marked a turning point. Dr. Mercer was a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard. He froze momentarily when he saw Coco, then gave Aunt Maggie a look that mixed exasperation and respect. "A black bear cub. Well, Mags, you never cease to surprise me." He examined Coco thoroughly, muzzling him temporarily as a precaution. The news was better than they dared hope. No broken bones, though the wound was deep and would leave a scar. "He's malnourished," Dr. Mercer noted, "but not severely. Must have been separated from his mother recently." He repacked his medical bag. The rehabilitation center in Asheville would be the safest option. What would happen to him there? Emma asked. "They'd care for him, minimize human contact, and release him when he's ready. It's his best chance." Emma looked at Coco, now sleeping peacefully after the examination, a new, proper bandage on his paw. How long until he's strong enough to transfer? Dr. Mercer and Aunt Maggie exchanged glances. 2 weeks, minimum, he said finally. That paw needs time to heal before he undergoes the stress of transport. 2 weeks. It wasn't much, but it was something. After the vet left, promising to return in a few days, Aunt Maggie surprised Emma by moving Coco from the tool shed to an empty stall in the small barn. She installed a child gate across the opening, giving him more room to move around. "Just temporary," she stressed, as Emma filled a shallow pan with fresh water. "And no one can know he's here." Over the next week, a routine developed. Emma woke early to feed Coco a mixture of fruit, honey, and special formula Dr. Mercer had provided. She cleaned his stall while Aunt Maggie changed his bandage. In the afternoons, they'd let him explore the barn under supervision, marveling at his growing strength and curiosity. Coco learned to recognize Emma's footsteps, greeting her with excited huffs and raised paws. He'd roll on his back when she scratched his chest, his eyes half closing in contentment. "He's acting like a dog," Aunt Maggie observed one evening, watching as Coco followed Emma around the stall, batting playfully at her shoelaces. "Is that bad?" Emma asked. "It's natural for him to bond with whoever's caring for him," Maggie explained. "But yes, it complicates things for when he needs to go back to the wild." Emma knew her aunt was right, but she couldn't bring herself to be more distant. Every day, Coco seemed to need her less physically, but want her presence more. He'd grow distressed when she left, standing at the gate with his paws pressed against it, watching the barn door. One afternoon, Emma arrived to find Aunt Maggie sitting on an overturned bucket beside Coco's stall, a distant look in her eyes. "Everything okay?" Emma asked, setting down her backpack. Maggie smiled faintly. "Just remembering, when I was about your age, my father, your grandfather, brought home an injured fox kit. We nursed it back to health right here in this barn. What happened to it? We released it when it was strong enough. For weeks afterward, it would come to the edge of the yard at dusk, just watching the house." Her voice softened. Then one day, it stopped coming. Emma sat beside her aunt. "Were you sad?" "Yes," Maggie admitted, "but also proud. That fox lived a fox's life because we helped but didn't hold on too tight." She glanced at Emma. "That's the balance we have to find with Coco." As if hearing his name, the cub wandered over and plopped down at their feet, his bandaged paw extended in what had become his signature pose whenever he wanted attention. Both of them laughed, the tension broken. That night, unable to sleep, Emma slipped out to the barn. Coco was awake, as if he'd been waiting for her. She sat beside his stall, and he pressed against the gate, his warm body radiating comfort. "I don't want you to go," she whispered, stroking his fur. "But I want you to have a good life. A bear life." Coco made a soft sound, as if he understood. A creak came from the barn door. Emma turned to see Aunt Maggie standing there, a quilt draped over her arm. "Thought you might be out here," she said, not sounding particularly surprised or upset. She crossed to Emma and draped the quilt over her shoulders. "It gets cold at night." Instead of returning to the house, Maggie sat down beside Emma. For a while, they just watched Coco together in comfortable silence. "When your dad called about sending you here," Maggie said finally, "I was terrified." Emma looked up, surprised. "You were? I've lived alone for so long. Haven't been around children much." She smiled ruefully. "Wasn't sure I'd be much good at having you here." "You're doing okay," Emma said, bumping her aunt's shoulder lightly. Maggie laughed. "Thanks to our friend here." She nodded toward Coco. "He's given us a project." "More than that," Emma said. "He's given us a connection." As the word left her mouth, Emma realized it was true. In just 2 weeks, she'd formed connections she never expected, with Coco, with Aunt Maggie, even with this wild, beautiful place that had felt so alien when she arrived. Coco stretched out beside the gate, his breathing deepening as he drifted to sleep. Tomorrow marked the 2-week point since they'd found him. Dr. Mercer would return to check his progress, and decisions would need to be made. But tonight, under a quilt and a sky filled with more stars than Emma had ever seen in Chicago, she allowed herself to simply be present in this unexpected moment of peace. The 2-week mark came and went. Dr. Mercer removed Coco's bandage, pronounced the wound healing well, but suggested another week of care. "Just to be safe," he'd said, with a knowing glance at Emma's relieved expression. But they couldn't delay the inevitable forever. As June melted into July, even Emma had to admit that Coco was ready. He'd grown noticeably, his movements more confident, his playfulness giving way to an increasing restlessness. Sometimes he would stand at his gate for hours, nose twitching at the sense of the forest beyond the barn. "He's telling us it's time," Aunt Maggie said gently one morning as they watched Coco pacing his stall. Dr. Mercer called. "The rehabilitation center has space now." Emma nodded, her throat tight. She'd known this was coming, had been preparing herself for weeks, but the reality still felt like a physical ache. "When?" she asked. Tomorrow morning, Jim will help us transport him. That night, Emma made her usual trip to the barn, but this time Aunt Maggie came along without comment. They sat together on hay bales, Coco sprawled between them, his belly full from the extra berries Emma had smuggled them. Will they take good care of him? Emma asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. The best, Maggie assured her. It's a place where bears can be bears with minimal human contact. He'll learn to forage, to den, to do everything he needs to survive in the wild. Will he remember us? Maggie's hand covered hers. Does it matter? Emma considered this. I guess not. What matters is that he's safe and free. She scratched the spot behind Coco's ears that always made him huff in contentment. I'm going to miss him, though. Me too, kiddo. Maggie's admission surprised Emma. He brought something special to the farm. At dawn, they prepared for the journey. The rehabilitation center was 3 hours away, tucked deep in the national forest where Coco would eventually be released. Dr. Mercer arrived with a specialized transport cage and a mild sedative to keep Coco calm during the trip. Emma had expected to feel nothing but sadness, but as she helped secure the cage in Aunt Maggie's truck, she found a quiet sense of purpose steadying her hands. This wasn't about what she wanted, it was about what Coco needed. The drive was mostly silent, Emma sitting in the back seat beside the cage, her fingers occasionally brushing against Coco's fur through the bars. The cub dozed, his breathing deep and even, unaware that his life was about to change again. The rehabilitation center was not what Emma had pictured. Instead of clinical buildings, they drove into a clearing surrounded by dense forest, with several large, natural-looking enclosures nestled among the trees. A woman with graying hair pulled into a practical braid met them at the entrance. I'm Linda, she said, her handshake firm. Maggie's told me about your rescue operation. Emma watched anxiously as Linda and Dr. Mercer carefully transferred the drowsy Coco to a quarantine enclosure, a spacious area with logs for climbing, a small pool, and plenty of vegetation for cover. He'll stay here for observation, Linda explained, then moved to a larger pre-release enclosure with limited human contact. Will he be alone? Emma asked, watching Coco explore his new surroundings, his movements still slowed by the sedative. Not for long. We have 2 other cubs about his age, both orphaned by poachers. Linda's expression darkened momentarily. They'll be companions for each other. That's good, Emma said, though the thought of Coco bonding with other bears instead of her brought a fresh wave of sadness. You shouldn't be alone. After completing the necessary paperwork and receiving promises of regular updates on Coco's progress, it was time to leave. Emma stood at the edge of the enclosure, fighting back tears. Goodbye, Coco, she whispered. Be a good bear. As if he understood, Coco turned toward her voice, his familiar dark eyes finding hers across the distance. For a brief moment, she could have sworn he recognized her. Then he turned away, distracted by a butterfly fluttering near his paw. The drive home was quieter still, the absence in the back seat palpable. Emma leaned her head against the window, watching the mountains roll by, so different from the city skyline she'd grown up with. You did a brave thing today, Aunt Maggie said as they neared the farm. Letting go is the hardest part of caring. Emma nodded, surprised to find she could smile. He's going to be okay, isn't he? Better than okay. He's going to be wild, exactly what he was meant to be. The rest of July passed in a blur of farm chores, exploration, and regular updates from Linda. Coco had transitioned well, was eating heartily, and had indeed bonded with the other cubs. In August, they were moved to the largest enclosure, a 10-acre section of forest where human contact was limited to occasional monitoring from a distance. On a warm afternoon a week before Emma was due to return to Chicago, a letter arrived with photos of Coco, now nearly twice the size he'd been when they'd found him, playing with his new companions. His injured paw had healed completely, though a scar remained visible in his fur. He looks happy, Emma said, studying the images. The frightened, wounded cub was gone, replaced by a confident young bear learning to be wild. You look happy too, Aunt Maggie observed. Different from when you first arrived. Emma realized it was true. Somewhere between rescuing Coco and learning to let him go, she'd changed. The city girl who'd arrived in June dreading 3 months of boredom had discovered something unexpected, a connection not just to one bear, but to this place, these mountains, and the ant she'd barely known. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching fireflies dance at the forest edge. Emma's father would arrive in 2 days to take her home, and for the first time, she felt conflicted about leaving. "I was thinking," Aunt Maggie said, breaking the comfortable silence, "you might want to come back next summer. The garden could use a helper, and I've got some ideas for expanding the chicken coop." Emma grinned. "I like that. And maybe," Maggie added, "we could drive up to the center sometime. Not to see Coco, he'll be deeper in the wild by then, but to see their work. They always need volunteers." As darkness settled over the valley, Emma thought about the journey from that first frightened cry in the forest to today. She had come looking for a lost summer and found a purpose instead. Coco was where he belonged, becoming the bear he was meant to be. And Emma was discovering who she could be, someone brave enough to help and strong enough to let go. That night, as an owl hooted somewhere in the dark forest, Emma fell asleep with the window open, listening to the wild voices of the mountains that were no longer strange, but somehow, unexpectedly, like home.